I want to thank you all for coming really because in this era of the 2-minute attention span, to hear an actual good fashioned, old fashioned lecture is an amazing honor for me to have your attention for as long as you choose to give it. And that's for all of you online as well. Thanks to Trudi for the opportunity to share one of my great loves historically, although it's hard to love such a subject, but also the theater is very, very important to me as well. Thank you to Alex for live streaming, and Misha is greeting over there. There are just some housekeeping. There's restrooms across the building, around the corridor, through the foyer to the right. And I'd like to make sure everybody on Zoom is muted, and we'll have time to take some questions after the talk. So I hope you'll all have your typing fingers ready to do that. I'm Victoria Weinstein. I've served this congregation for the past 11 years. I am a Unitarian Universalist minister of 29 years tenure at this date. So many of us, as Trudi said, know the colonial witch trials in Salem. It's quite amazing that 332 years ago today, Giles, Corey, are you nodding? Do you know what today is the anniversary of? He died today. He was pressed to death. More weight. And the reason he was pressed to death rather than hanged is complicated, and you can research that, but the colonials thought that that was equivalent to stoning to death, which was considered a biblical form of capital punishment, if people wonder why stones. So very sobering. It's amazing to me that people walk around with T-shirts in Salem as tourists, and they have things that say more weight and other jokey slogans. We're in a culture of such constant exposure to violence, political, state-sanctioned violence. I think there's been a massive numbing and desensitization. There are millions of people down the road, or they're going to be in the next weeks, having a grand time, who will laugh and take selfies in the cemetery and enjoy the frisson of spookiness they feel when hearing about what happened in 1692. And they will make some sweeping generalizations about Puritans and go on with their day. So part of my aim tonight is to stop with you and to think more deeply about the history of witchcraft accusations in the Western world, what they have meant to the communities that have experienced them, why they happened, and how the same kinds of behavior persist to this day. When Trudi told me she was directing the Crucible, I was really excited because Arthur Miller's play is a really excellent interpretation of what happened. Even as he melds some of the players together into one character, and he invents some details, such as the affair between Abigail Williams, who is much younger in real life, and John Proctor. But he's true to the history. There was a Reverend Samuel Parris who was both a traumatized survivor of Indian raids in Maine, during which his entire congregation was killed and he fled for safety. And he also was a troublesome man and a terrible pastor. I say this as his colleague, and not as distant as some may presume. In 2002, I will tell you that I was called to be the first female settled minister of the First Parish Church in Norwell, Massachusetts. And all of the first parishes are actually historically derived from the first Puritan churches in the Commonwealth. One of my predecessors in the pulpit was none other than Deodat Lawson, and you may recognize that name. He was the immediate predecessor of Samuel Parris before Parris came into that church. And Deodat Lawson went to Norwell in 1694, so just 2 years after the Salem crisis. He was fired by my former congregation for having too much absenteeism, which is really fascinating. And I think he was still involved in what was happening on the North Shore. So he was just piecing out for 3 months at a time, and they fired him. These are my colleagues. I earned my doctorate in 2011 and wrote my thesis on the covenant theology and ecclesiology that connects the Puritans with what evolved to become the Unitarian Universalist tradition. ironically, now perhaps the most liberal and heretical tradition, quite frankly, that exists in America today. The most heretical establishment church, if you will. Samuel Paris, Cotton Mather, the Reverend John Hale of Beverly, these are my colleagues who would have been aghast to see a woman in the pulpit, let alone a tarot reading, intentionally single and child-free woman living independently of male rule. They would have not recognized me in my role, but I recognize them. And part of my passion for this area of scholarship is to confront the damage that they did, while also perhaps humanizing them a little bit for those for whom they are a stereotype of religiously sanctioned misogyny and racism. So I welcome you in that spirit, and I want to say in advance, this talk is difficult. It contains some deeply upsetting information. So I've done my best to tread carefully in the descriptions of some of the harrowing violence inflicted on the victims of the witch trials. But if you need to leave or walk around or go get some fresh air, the courtyard's right through those doors, or react vocally, we're all here together. We'll understand. We're holding this space together. The first time I ever read the Malleus Maleficarum, which is the hammer of the witches, and I'll explain to you what that means a little bit later. It was a guide to torturing those accused of witchcraft to try to extract the truth from them. This was meant to save their souls, believe it or not. I broke out into such a serious case of hives, I had to be taken by ambulance to the hospital. I believe that our bodies hold history in a way that's not only genetically inherited from our ancestors, but I don't know how we might also inherit some kind of generational trauma from those to whom we are not kinfolk relations. I don't know what I believe. I don't know about past lives. I just know that when I was about 9 years old, apparently, and this is my father told me this years later, I was obsessed with the show Bewitched. Obsessed. I loved Endora way more than Samantha. But I went to my dad and I said, Daddy, can we go to Salem, Massachusetts sometime? And he said, yeah, I think we can. I grew up in Connecticut. He said, it's pretty close by. We can drive up there. Why do you want to go? And I said, oh, it was in Bewitched. And he said, sweetie, there was pretty serious history that happened there, and I want you to know about it. And I want you to know that it was a place where people who were called witches got persecuted and they died. They got executed. And I was, this was really serious and scary news to me. But apparently, according to my father, this is what I said. I said, how did they die? And my father told me they hanged them. And I replied, I remember being burned. I don't remember that. But that was from my father, who passed away in 1983. So for Giles Corey and these men and women executed in Salem Village between June 10th and September 22nd, 1692, and all of the victims, those who loved them, those who were caught up in the crisis and fled for their lives, we gather in a spirit of responsibility and moral urgency, and I will name them: Bridget Bishop, John Willard, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Martha Corey, Susanna Martin, Mary Eastie, Rebecca Nurse, Alice Parker, Sarah Wilds, Mary Parker, George Burroughs, Anne Puttiator, Martha Carrier, Margaret Scott, George Jacobs, Wilmot Reed, John Proctor, and Samuel Wardwell. And I live a few blocks down from Wardwell Avenue in Lynn. I don't know if it's a relation. What many people don't know is that what happened up the road from us was late and it's actually a very small blip on the map of the larger witch hysteria that occurred mostly in the Germanic-speaking lands of continental Europe between roughly 1560 and 1700. That was the heyday, although I hate to use that term, during which tens of thousands of innocent people were subjected to the inquisitorial process of interrogation under torture and executed for the crime of witchcraft. This isn't Germany. I just want to be clear. This is not what we know now as the nation of Germany. It's a geographically much bigger swath of what was known as the Holy Roman Empire. The majority of arrests and trials occurred there, but they were also recorded. They weren't just there. They were also recorded as far away as Russia. Scotland had a little outbreak. Scandinavia had some witch trials, and Italy. But 3/4 of the executions occurred in the Germanic Low Countries. So Anne Llewellyn Barstow, in her 1994 book, Witch Craze, A New History of the European Witch Trials, estimates that close to 25,000 victims were executed just in that region. And I will be including a recommended reading list for those of you who'd like to do further research, and we'll put that on the church website following this talk tonight. I'm going to add to it a little bit. So estimates vary. Oh, unable to access microphone. Well, we don't want that. Okay. Estimates vary, but conservative estimates based on the record is that at least 80,000 people went on trial and 40,000 were executed. Just to give a bit of, scale there, the city of Salem in its last census registered 25,000 people. So that's actually a conservative estimate, as there were also vigilante killings of the accused and lynchings. They were killed by being burnt at the stake and other ways. If the magistrate was merciful in the formal cases, they might be strangled or beheaded first. Why? How? This wasn't a little wave of madness. It went on for a long time. And I don't believe that this era in European history is taught in our schools. It has left a legacy that is not discussed, and I feel that it needs to be. So let's go back to the 16th century in this region, where a multitude of factors contributed to conditions of paranoia and persecution. So this geographic area already had a tradition of persecution by that point, the persecution of Jews, heretics, and any other group considered deviant. Germany was the center of the profound tensions of the Holy Roman Empire because, as you may recall, the Protestant Reformation happened with the Martin Luther nailing his theses on the door in Wittenberg Cathedral in 1517. So the period that we identify as the height of the witch craze was one of really extraordinary political instability, and the geographic area seems to have been particularly right for the religious zealotry that convinced entire towns and villages that the devil was seducing thousands of women into his service. And this really is a rural phenomenon, overwhelmingly so. And there are a lot of class dynamics at play, just as was the case in Salem Village, which was a little bit more of a, backwater from Salem town. So there are class issues, and that plays into the intimidation before the magistrates. And suddenly I can't find my words and I can't recite the Lord's Prayer. I stumble over the words. That's evidence that you're a witch. You can see how some of this, it's just a terrible dynamic. So these people, and this of course is very true for the folks of Salem, they had a completely magical worldview, signs and wonders. I think that's so hard for us to relate to today, the scope of things they did not know anything about. Maybe less so these days, since we have revealed more lately that there's a lot of magical thinking, even in the 21st century. But 16th century, we're in a pre-scientific era. And there's widespread, unquestioned assumptions that God's hand is in everything. Everything that happens means something, has significance. And the devil is very, very real, not a metaphor, he's real. And there's no room for ambiguity or complexity in this worldview. There is a cosmic battle occurring all the time between the forces of good and evil. And we can watch, of course, in our own context. Where do we see black and white thinking? There's no, opportunity to see ambiguity. You can see this in some of the dialogue of the Crucible, the intensity of the questioning and of the responses, because this isn't just your mortal life we're talking about. This is your eternal soul. So think for a moment what it would be like to really deeply believe that you could suffer for eternity in a fiery hell for not following God's law in this life. So when Rebecca Nurse says to John Proctor, spoiler alert, after he confesses to save his life, she says, John, you want to say it? God send his mercy on you. That's one of the lines, right? John, God send his mercy on you. Yes. Oh God, John, God send his mercy on you. And this is a moment of serious spiritual distress for her friend. If you bear false witness against yourself, it's also breaking one of the 10 commandments. And this is very real for them. And we know about Rebecca Nurse that she was a deeply faithful and incredibly well-respected woman in the village. And what happened to her is far worse than is reported in the Crucible. And you may know that she was accused, she was convicted, and then her conviction was overturned. And then it was overturned again. I mean, the cruelty of that. I went to divinity school with one of her ancestresses, Jennifer Innes. And that's the thing about the Salem history. This is family history. This is local, and there are people who still live in this area. This is very personal. It's not healed. It's not resolved. So at this time in Europe and the colonies, folk practices and Christian religion are intertwined because of course, there's no scientific understanding of anything, and they're living in a very perilous world. So charms and spells and folk magic were practiced by just about everyone in all social classes. Infant mortality was very, very high. Between a sixth and a third of all newborns did not live to their first year. And I know there's a character in the Crucible who is really suffering trauma from this, and she's particularly susceptible to what the girls are doing with the fits and so on. It's very sad. When I was in France in 2019, I happened to stumble upon, although there's no accidents, an exhibit of actual transcripts from the witch trials in Europe. This was at the Museum of Archives in Paris. And I was heartbroken as I traveled through the cases and looked at the actual, I mean, these people kept meticulous records because they thought they were doing something so good by ridding their region of the cursed witch. I was heartbroken to see how many of the interrogations were related to reproductive issues. Young women brought in because they'd had miscarriages, or they were suspected of attempting abortion or consulting a midwife or having 2 children die. One, we understand. 2, you may know that midwives were often the first in a village to be under suspicion and accused. Anyone who had power and knowledge to heal was very easily blamed and persecuted for unexplained harm. And they were tortured and they died for it. I found a 16th century French edict, and this is frightening to me given what we're going through in this country today, that required women to register their pregnancies and to have a witness at the moment of birth. If the baby was stillborn or died at birth and the mother had failed to comply with these laws, she was certain to be executed. I felt that it was important to share this. Again, it's so heavy. It's so horrifying. And yet, there is that history. I attended a fundraiser last night for the MAP, Massachusetts Medical Abortion Project, which provides mifepristone kits to women in all 50 states who request it. And this is still legal for now. But women and those who provide reproductive health care are still under the threat of arrest, interrogation, and state-sanctioned violence. More factors in 16th century Europe. plagues and the war that decimated the male population so that women outnumbered men in every age group by 1500. This is a change from the early Middle Ages where men tended to outlive women, and a population shortage heightened women's value as bearers of children. The 16th century, by contrast, saw an unprecedented number of unattached women, masterless females who were an economic burden on their families and communities at a time of increasingly stressful inflation. Most of the women accused of witchcraft early on were precisely the widows and spinsters most expendable in their society and suspect for autonomy. That was mostly involuntary and undesired. They weren't like, yay, single power, women. It was because of death and a lack of marriageable partners. One writer described the widows and spinsters, who were very often the first to be accused in a village, as the ones who were, quote, the least powerful but the most dangerous. This is from Joseph Clates, who wrote a book called Servants of Satan. Some of these books have really lurid titles, There was also an obsession with death that we can perhaps understand a little bit better, having lived through and living through the COVID pandemic. You can imagine the fear of that time. Remember that the Black Death had killed 20% of the population in the first plague of 1347. And sporadic but potent outbreaks of plague were a really regular feature of European life until a final epidemic in France in 1720. So you can really see those corresponding with witch executions and persecutions. A scholar of the witch trials named G.R. Quaife wrote that, quote, the survival of such a disproportionate number of women in the plague prompted popular preachers to suggest that the devil protected his own. That's cute, right? So you can see seeds being planted for this madness. And let's talk about syphilis, another alarming health threat that arrived in the 15th century. Painful, potentially fatal disease that significantly increased male anxieties and antagonism towards females. The scourge of syphilis did not do anything to ameliorate men's hostile and conflicted attitudes about their own and women's sexuality. I also think it's worth taking a look at some of the legal shifts that occurred in Europe at this time that made a really big difference in moving these cases through the courts. And keeping in mind that there's not really a separation of secular courts and religious powers. They're very much enmeshed in one and the same, or coordinated in this era. Heresy was the greatest crime imaginable because it was, flouting God's authority as interpreted by men, of course, and it threatened the entire community. So all of the torture and bloodshed and public violence was believed to be for the greater good. And the changes to the legal system, and I'm going to try to review some of this because it's a lot, but this is the adoption of Roman law in Europe. So it shifts from the accusatorial system where a suspect knew her accusers and the charges that they had brought to the inquisitorial process where legal authorities themselves brought the case. So you can see that it's a different scenario when you're showing up and someone's accused you. I saw Goody Weinstein dancing with the devil, and you can say, listen, Goody Hansen, I know that you stole my cow or whatever. And then this anonymous power bringing you in, and you don't know even what the charges are. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. And then, of course, there's financial dimensions of all of the witch trials with land grabs and property disputes and inheritances at stake. And this is a huge factor in the Salem Village crisis. Arthur Miller, I think, does a very good job weaving that into his play, and he didn't make it up. That's all transcript history, all of those disputes. It's like petty village, fights and money, same stuff that happens today. Who owns the property and who you're going to give it to or leave it to? I'm going to sue you. Also, an aspect of the newly adopted Roman law, unfortunately, was the requirement that a suspect has to confess before being executed. And this gives rise to the use of torture. The less said about that, I think, the better. We have some very distressing letters. There's one that remains by a man named Junius, or Johannes Junius of Bamberg. And in 1628, he's imprisoned and he writes to his daughter Veronica about all of these people who've confessed against him. And he says, all false through compulsion, as they have all told me, and begged my forgiveness in God's name before they were executed. They know nothing but good of me. They were forced to say it just as I myself was. Just really hard to hold that, and to think about how often people under the most unimaginable duress named others. And that's part of human nature. And that is why the use of torture is, of course, not a humane practice. It's not effective. It just gets people to confess something. Herr Junius actually was a man of some means. He was able to bribe his jailers to get that letter out. But so many people had no access to that, and so they in many cases died in prison, or died as a result of having been imprisoned and malnourished and traumatized and having fallen ill in prison and so forth. Let's talk about the fact that witches were mostly women. The assumption that accused witches the assumption that witches were going to be women was firmly ensconced into the European consciousness by the 16th century. And this is due to misogynist theological doctrine and teachings, but can really be credited to the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, which I referenced before, the Hammer of the Witches, authored in the late 15th century by two Dominican priests. I actually hate to say their names, but Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. Seriously. Published in 1487, this was a handbook for the interrogation of witches. So prior to the Malleus Maleficarum, no other works on witchcraft had argued that witches were more likely to be women than men. And the Malleus Maleficarum uses the feminine form of the word maleficarum. So it's more appropriate actually to translate the title as the hammer of the female evildoers than the hammer of the witches. Men were accused of doing sorcery, but women were accused for what they were. The premise of the Malleus Maleficarum was that woman's insatiable lust made her an easy target for the devil, who had dominion over those base human qualities, sexuality. And this document, don't read it, don't do that to yourself, but it's a totally insane work of perverse and repressed sexual fantasies and projection. These men had sick minds, and they're two of the worst criminals the world has ever produced. This book was wildly popular, and it was available to, and it was studied by the magistrates and the clergy of Salem. Okay, so they had that, they studied it, they spent time with it. It was their blueprint. And what's so sad is that in the 10th century, in a 10th century canon episcopi, that work had denounced the belief. This is a Catholic statement, formal canonical statement, denounced the belief in the existence of witches who worship the devil and flew at night. It dismissed it all as pagan superstition. In the 10th century, can you imagine how much we could have avoided? And it was dismissed as an insult to God's omnipotence. It's also the case that the clergy in the Salem situation had very serious conflicts within and among themselves about what was going on. And I don't know if you know that. This is such a warning about how any of us can be swayed by peer pressure or pressure in the moment to fix a problem in our town or in our leadership position. In 1692, Cotton Mather wrote up a lengthy paper on areas of concern around the accusations and trials for witches. And he was already in May of 1692. May. So this is before anybody goes to death in Salem. Concerned about the legitimacy of spectral evidence, which is the whole thing where, and you see the girls doing this in Salem. I see Goody Proctor, I see a little yellow bird, and she's, oh, what are you doing up there? It's this hysteria or imagination or whatever it is. That's spectral evidence. And Cotton Mather, before anybody was convicted of capital, witchcraft, already expressed concern about that. Is it legit? We don't know. And so there was this paper that he authored called The Return of Several Ministers, meaning like the response of several ministers. They got together, some of the clergy who were involved with this got together and talked about it. And Cotton Mather wrote it up. And I don't know if the actor playing Susanna Martin, I don't think Susanna Martin's a character in the Crucible, but Susanna Martin, who's one of the Salem village victims, actually raised those same objections at her examination. Same problem. She said, she argued effectively that it is shown in the Bible that Satan can take the form of an innocent person to cause mayhem. Satan can do that. We see that in the Bible. And you know what Cotton Mather called her? One of the most impudent, scurrilous, wicked creatures in the world. And she was hanged on July 19th of that year. You want to say fragile male ego? Because I will. Right? She had theological learning. She argued a theological point that he and his clergy colleagues had already decided was convincing, and yet there's a memorial to her. And not one to Cotton Mather. So let's take another look at some of the things that Kramer and Sprenger published that became standards of 16th century demonology and formed the basis for the court cases. Some of them will sound very familiar to you because of the Crucible. Oops, excuse me. Okay. Witches have sex with the devil at night orgies. I'm going to have to cough again. See, if I was a Puritan, I'd make some meaning out of this. It's displeasing to the Lord that you speak on these things. That's how they work. Okay, so witches have sex with the devil at night orgies. They fly through the air to attend secret sabbats that are like a perverse inversion of the Catholic Mass. They use the flesh of unbaptized infants in ritual. This is, by the way, the same accusation that was levied at Jewish people in the early modern period as they are being expelled from Spain and other places. The witch is a woman and sometimes a man, seen as one who had made an explicitly sexual covenant with the devil to serve him in a sort of depraved parody of the ideal Protestant marriage. So a lot of people don't have any knowledge that Protestants were doing as much interrogation and accusation and execution of witches as Catholics. People think the Catholic Inquisition. No, this is also a Protestant phenomenon. Isn't it nice that they could share that in common? So it's just an incredible silence around the Protestant activity at the same time, the exact same dynamic. And the Malleus Maleficarum was very popular with Protestants as well as Catholics. Luther had ideas about why women were particularly susceptible to being malefica, but his was less about sexuality and more about women's innate weakness of character. She was perpetually infantile and fearful, especially of her children's fate. Instead of relying on God or her husband as she ought to, the witch would turn to the devil to influence her reality. So, like, women can't win, you know? Some of the greatest hits from the Malleus Maleficarum, just so you can hear a little bit of this authoritative guide to interrogating witches. Some quotes. All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable. They make jokes about dead women. Very funny. Witches are malevolent practitioners of abortion, infanticide, and even cannibalism. And no one does more harm to the Catholic faith, they say, than midwives. So it's a call to violence. There are entire books and documentaries about the takeover of midwifery in that era, from being female-led to being male-led, and you can explore that on your own. But women were effectively terrorized out of that profession and that work, and are in recent decades really are just beginning to recover their roles as midwives and doulas and OBGYNs. I'm going to skip that part. That was from Twitter. Women commenting on some of the assumptions that their OBGYNs had about the level of pain involved in IUD. Yeah, okay, insertion and removal. And it was sort of like, yeah, it's just going to pinch a little bit. And they, no, I fainted from the pain. Can we please use anesthesia? This kind of lack of care of women and their bodies is deeply rooted in medical misogyny, which is deeply rooted in this history. So all of this knowledge of how to assuage pain in childbirth and pregnancy and miscarriage, knowledge of herbal and kitchen remedies were gone as the midwives were eliminated. And the men who replaced them were schooled in the biblical admonition given to Eve: in sorrow, thou shalt bring forth children. The great church father, Tertullian, described women in the 2nd century as a temple built over a sewer, the devil's gateway. He's considered the father of Western Christianity. Luther had a more generous treatment of the biblical Eve, who was disobedient, but also held up as blessed for her ability to procreate and serve as perfect mate to Adam. But yet Martin Luther also said of women, let them bear children to death. They are created for that. Mary had suffered in giving birth to Jesus, so pain had spiritual meaning. A good woman endured the trials of childbearing, while the witch supposedly could not even feel the sensation of pins being thrust into her body during interrogation. We know from Kramer and Sprenger and others that Catholic doctrine had a virgin whore binary with the unattainable perfection and purity of the Virgin Mary, and a sex-phobic male clergy whose sexual lives had to be conducted in shameful and dangerous secrecy and repression. And we see the consequences of this pathological system into our own generation. But Luther, who critiqued clerical celibacy and married and had children, taught some fairly more woman-positive things, like if your husband is unable to have sexual relations with you, and you're going to find this, I think, remarkable, find someone who can, rather than divorce or remain barren. Okay, all right. I didn't expect that from you, Luther. But it was the Reformation era, also the witch craze era, during which Protestantism develops and brutally enforces an ideology of the housewife and mother as the only appropriate roles for women in society. If she doesn't belong to a husband, then she must belong to the devil. And I'm thinking about those really young girls in Salem who didn't yet have husbands, but were hoping to be marriageable at some point, and how careful they would have to be to make sure that their statements didn't implicate them as witches, but that they were careful to be the victims of witchcraft. And I have no idea what their psychology was, but that's one of their realities. There's no other role in their lives but wife and mother. So anyway, the mother at home, and this is Clarissa Atkinson, a scholar of her book is called The Oldest Vocation, Christian Motherhood in the Middle Ages. She says, the mother at home, installed in a patriarchal household and naturally inclined, so it was thought, towards its service and sacrifice, was created for the West in early modern Europe. Her image is so familiar that we fail to recognize its originality. We are inclined to see her as eternal, but she's not eternal. Women were forced into compliance with these options. Luther accepted women only as sexual beings, but only for the purpose of establishing the most important institution on earth, which is the family. So I want to talk a little bit about the phenomenon of possession, which is so obviously the whole story in Salem. And it's also a big factor in some of the more sensationalistic cases of malefica in, early modern Europe. I'm thinking there was one really famous one in a French convent. So that's fascinating because you talk about a contained, very repressed group of women together and, the contagion of hysteria or whatever was happening. These were very big stories in their days, and you know what? They got around. So just as happens nowadays, you have copycat phenomena, and it's not conscious and it's not intentional. It is something that happens through social contagion. So we think that it's very likely that the kids in Salem would have heard possibly of these tales. Again, it's not ancient history for them. And this is the kind of thing, as you're engaging in religious instruction of young ones, you would share these stories because the devil is afoot. He's in the woods, and he's in your bad thoughts and everything. And did you know that? So we don't know exactly how that happened, but it's important to note that many children made accusations of witchcraft in Europe. They did. And it's also tragically true that they were also executed for the crime of witchcraft in Europe. Little kids. So sometimes you'd have whole families and entire villages wiped out. The theory, by the way, that the girls in Salem were victims of ergot poisoning through eating moldy rye bread has really been discredited, but that was a very hot theory for a while, like in the 80s and the 90s. Subsequent research has kind of said that doesn't really hold as a factor. So if that was something you were interested in, that's the latest that I know. There are a lot of good studies out there on the psychology of possession and mass possession, and that those mass possessions are probably prompted by an unconscious desire for an outlet. For those who live in severely repressed circumstances, who have a lot of realities they're not allowed to speak and things they're not allowed to talk about, bringing some relief from the crushing boredom of domestic life, which certainly was the case in Salem, bringing some physical freedom and opportunity to behave outrageously. I think about that with the girls in Salem Village. Like, they weren't going to dances. Nobody was putting on their tunes and going for a walk and dancing it out. Not in that culture. So they were given permission, if you will, to curse, to shout, to sing, to behave outrageously, to fling their skirts up in the air and rip their bodices, those stupid corsets. And of course, there was the ringleader in most cases, the charismatic figure at the center of the drama, to whom the other victims looked for cues. And this is so interesting because I think about Trudi as a director making decisions with your actors about what is going on? Are they looking to each other, or are all the girls all spontaneously erupting in these fits? And that's the kind of thing that is so wonderful about drama, is the director and the actors make those decisions together about motives and about the dynamics that are occurring in the courtroom. And by the way, I hope you all go see The Crucible. It's intense. Just be ready for that. So, we don't know about Abigail Williams. Like Tituba, she is lost to history. We know that Tituba was sharing indigenous practices with the Puritan girls, but we don't know what was going on in the psychology of Abigail or Betty or any of the other accusers. And there were many more of those accusers than we see in the cast of The Crucible. We only know that hysteria is infectious. There's a lot of material out there about the rise of guilds and professional jobs, and how women who dared to succeed beyond their husbands' positions were punished. And again, that's interesting research you're free to do. Let's just say that the division of labor issue between heterosexual couples that lasts until this very day is not a random development. The fact that hundreds of thousands more women than men left the workforce during the pandemic is not a random development. This gender hierarchy is still considered by many Americans to be divinely ordered. So we need to ask ourselves what remains in our lives of all of this, and understand that it is the result of factors. It isn't divinely ordained. It didn't arise naturally or organically. And so, as Anne Llewellyn Barstow wrote, women were accused primarily by men, tried by male jailers, burned to death by male executioners, all while being prayed over by male pastors. It was a process of education by terrorization. That's how I see this whole epic. I think that it was a project of domesticating women and getting them to be compliant and obedient under threat of extreme violence. And when you see some of the instruments of torture that were used and what parts of the body they target, it lands with great horror. So I don't recommend seeing those instruments. I have seen them in Europe during an exhibit that was held by Amnesty International. But this kind of project was, of course, present in the colonies. It was part of the ideology of the Puritans. And I think that it should be studied alongside the brutality of the slave trade and genocidal colonization of indigenous Americans as part of the history and foundation of this nation and our inheritance, for better or for worse, but for worse. As we approach Halloween, I just want to encourage you to look at some images of witches that you may have passed by all your life without ever thinking about. Sometimes I've done a slideshow of iconography of witches. I didn't do that tonight. But I want you to know some of the casual demonization of the older woman, the crone figure, and notice how she is depicted with the hook nose, which is not just a nod to anti-Semitism, but it's a reflection of the loss of calcium experienced by older women, many of whom had multiple pregnancies and born a lot of children, and lose calcium and therefore lose their teeth. And there she is with the wart on the chin. And any of us who are older women know with great recognition the hairs coming out of the chin. And this is all just a natural aging process. So when you see that terrible, fearsome crone, it's just a woman who's aged. And the connection between that and the prevalence of plastic surgery and pumping, all kinds of things in our faces to lift the cheeks and to give that young appearance. I mean, this is all still connected. And look at the sexualized witch. And think about all those sexual fantasies that were projected onto random women. and the sanitized witch, the fun, unthreatening one who might grant your wish. And just think about what unconscious ideas and fears about women that they reinforce. Ask yourself why the witch archetype has come down to us exclusively as female. Now you have better background on that. And I do hope that you'll go see the Crucible, and that when it's possible, attend productions also of some more recent plays written by women that shed more light on the girls' experience in Salem. Their imaginative rewritings of that. They use the Salem crisis as a jumping off point for these authors. So I'm speaking of the plays The Good John Proctor by Talene Monahan. I don't know if anybody saw it at the Providence Trinity Rep a couple of years ago. Becky Nurse of Salem is a play by Sarah Rule that was also done at Trinity Rep. And John Proctor is the villain currently playing on Broadway by Kimberly Bellflower. So thank you for coming and for the honor of your attention and intensity of absorbing all of this. I don't know how much of it was new to you, but I hope it was insightful. And this talk will remain posted on our website at uucgl.org for as long as it is allowed by our constitutionally protected freedom of speech. And now I'd like to invite you to ask questions. Do you want to say something about tickets to? Yeah, Trudi. Comment.
Thanks very much, Vicki. Yes, the tickets can be gotten on the Marblehead Little Theater website, which is mltlive.org. And I guess they're selling pretty well. But I also wanted to say that we in the cast have explored many of the themes that you brought up. But I wanted to mention that I think an important thing about this play is that it was written in the 50s by Arthur Miller in response to the McCarthy trials and McCarthyism and the Red Scare. And he and his colleagues were living under a terrible threat where if anyone said anything against McCarthy, they would be accused of being communists. But the play has survived since then and has become one of the most important American classics and is taught in schools throughout the country. And part of the reason, I think, for its endurance is not only the fact that people are endlessly fascinated with the Salem witch trials, but also because it is a totally universal message of witch hunts that occur not just during McCarthy, but throughout history.
Yeah, thank you. Marblehead Little Theater is in downtown Marblehead on School Street. Lovely little space, wonderful. And buy tickets fast because they do sell out. Thanks.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I'm amazed by the numbers. I mean, it just seems shocking to me that, yes, I understand that, a bunch of hysterical kids can get things whipped up and then, people join in and what happened here in Salem. But across Europe, the numbers sound extraordinary.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and as I said, truly, they are, it's more than is formally recorded. And the thing that is, they left really excellent records. All of these little villages and so forth, they were so proud of what they were doing that the document history is there. So it's not like people are trying to just make it, bigger than it was. Yeah. When you read some of the statements, the tone of virtue, because they're eradicating this danger from their village, and it's, yes, so many applications to today, because human nature is human nature, Yeah. And by the way, I am looking, we're going to look online. We're going to look at our chat room too. Oh, I have a microphone on. Oh, I'm going to go up there. What am I doing? Okay. Hi.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, talk right into.
So
Can you hold it up?
I
Hold up.
don't know if you have researched this, but I'm kind of curious, and it's always been a question in the back of my mind when I hear about histories like what you've just discussed, is given the high rate of infant mortality and the high rate of the death of the mothers bearing the children and disease and just so how many people would die through natural causes, and yet it's promoted that families come first. And Luther was a very popular person in his time, and the emphasis on how important families are. Why would people voluntarily kill others, which decreases the family? The mother isn't there to care for the young children, or the mother isn't there to reproduce and make more family. I don't understand that.
Right. Because the irrationality of it, I think, is very hard for us to grasp. Why would you separate? Why would you espouse an ideology of families first and the nuclear family and separate children from their parents? You know, there's a lot of ways in which people who are in the grips of certainty and righteousness, especially religious zealotry and that form of righteousness, will do things that are extremely contrary to the well-being of that which they claim to honor and even love. And it's just very sobering, and it's a very somber reality. And it's absolutely true. That's right. They were murdering members of their society who were the ones who could bring more lives into that society following a plague. And all of that. And this is why we see also the emphasis on the older, quote unquote, useless women past childbearing years, who are very much in the era when the witch hysteria really gets going in Europe. They are expensive. And they are also the ones who don't have a good social filter, as you will know if you have achieved that age as a woman, that your nice, smiley face is less likely to show up when you don't feel like putting it on. And you might grumble and you might tell someone off, and then suddenly you're in the scold's bridle with metal affixed in your mouth to keep you silent and punished for talking back. So when I say it's the domestication and punishment of women, it really is. And so that's why the victims in the beginnings are usually the older, problematic, mouthy old broads who can't earn anything and can't have babies. It's really hard.
Thank you so much for that. We actually just came down from Beverly because we saw this advertised by the little theater. So we're not members here.
That's awesome.
But yeah, this was really great. So my question is, most of this stuff is stuff that I haven't read directly, but I have friends who've read things. There was a book, The Gods and Goddesses of Old Europe, which you might be familiar with, but it talked about some of this phenomenon coming from the repression of the pantheistic earlier religions that were in Europe, and that this was partly driven by the church's desire to eradicate those other forms of worship. And interestingly too, like there's also, again, this is by reference, there's the so-called pagan Trinity, the Virgin Mother and crone, right? And so, yeah. And so the demonization of that crone and the adoption of the Virgin Mary,
Okay, I know where you're going, and
it's a question because I don't know.
No, I'm gonna jump in because I think
I'm curious.
There was a lot of what I would call revisionist history in the 1980s when I was kind of coming into my interest in all of this, like the disappearance of the goddess and all of the, how Christianity, quote unquote, wiped out paganism. My argument would be that's not really true, because a lot of what happened with what we call paganism was incorporated, and it was incorporated into Christian practice, Christian life, Christian festivals and observances and holidays and holy days. And so I'm not going to say that there wasn't violence in the conversion of pagan peoples. There was a lot of violence. There was not necessarily, the witchcraft accusations were not so much part of that. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't be called in for doing something like worshiping trees or keeping a holy site at a well. It doesn't mean that your priest might not do something. So there was some overlap, but the witch hysterias of the witch trials were not, we don't really see a lot of evidence that they were about you are doing pagan practices, because those folkloric kinds of beliefs and practices were really, really interspersed with people's Christian lives. So the people who went to the stake considered themselves Christian. Now, they might have been doing some things that caused suspicion, but it's the same thing in Salem. And this was in the 90s. We did a lot of research and revising of some of the historical tours, and the docents and things in the museums had to be re-educated, because there was for a while this narrative that what happened in Salem was that Wiccans, people who were witches or pagans, were executed. And they weren't. They were Puritan Christians. They completely understood that themselves to be so. They were deeply religious people, and they had a Christian self-identity. So that got corrected. I was happy to see that. And so now when people go to Salem and they go around, they're not told, oh, well, this is a persecution of Wiccans. And that doesn't mean, though, I mean, sort of both and. It doesn't mean that in the process of Christianizing Europe, that there wasn't suppression of practices that were more body positive, more nature connected, more seasonal. It doesn't mean that they were. It just that the witchcraft, the accusations in the judicial process is not so much tied to that. Does that answer your question pretty well?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I was really curious about that. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. And that's like Merlin Stone, goddesses in every woman. And there was a lot of inventive and creative archaeology and so forth that happened in the 80s and 90s.
Reverend Vicky,
Sure.
I may have missed this because there was just so much in your talk, but the Puritans that we learn about in the Crucible were from England, and perhaps a certain area in England even. And when you started the talk, you were talking about the Holy Roman Empire and the Germanic area, and that seemed to be in Europe the hotbed. Did you draw a line between that and how the witchcraft kind of power got into the Puritans in London or wherever they were, and then came? Did you draw that line? Because if you did, I missed it. I'd like to hear it again.
I didn't talk about it a whole lot. When did we have the printing press? 1500. So think about pamphlets and written treatises as being kind of the social media of the 16th century and the 17th century. It's very hot. And so those who are in England who are they're protesting the excesses of the Anglican Church and so forth, they decide to come to the colonies in the 17th century. They have got their hands on a lot of written material that is coming from the continent. So there's a very active publishing life, and they are reading the Malleus Maleficarum, and they're reading all of these treatises on things like the acts of Satan and his mighty wonders in the innocent souls and so forth. So they're really eagerly reading all this. This is a very literate group of people. The Puritans are very, very educated for their time, and they're very scholarly. So they're getting their hands on all kinds of theology and all kinds of persuasive pamphlets and essays and things that are coming out of the continent. They would have been written in German. They would have been, and these are all people who are multilingual. So they're reading, some is in Latin, but a lot of it's, in the language of the divines who wrote it, or the magistrates. Probably some of the legal things are in Latin, and a lot of it's in German. But all of them speak German. They speak and read Latin. They speak and read, well, they mostly read multiple languages. So that's part of it, is how this gets disseminated. And on a happy note, I mean, also some really wonderful things get communicated from the continent to Europe, and to the dissidents who end up being the ancestors of our tradition, so there's just a lot of theological conversation, debate, like beef, like rappers have beef. There are certain ministers and theologians from across continents who have beef with each other, and they just keep publishing. And then, these things are very popular, and they're very dear, and they travel with letters and so forth on ships across the sea, and they get into people's hands. They're valuable. To own books in this time was quite something, and a sign of great wealth. Yes. Yeah. Great. Hi, Zoom. Hi, everybody on Zoom. Thank you so much for being here. Yeah, that would be great. Actually, can someone, Misha, grab him a microphone? Thanks, Alex. I know. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So this is from 𝐒𝐫𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐳. I'm sorry if I didn't say your name correctly, who's playing Reverend Paris in the Crucible.
Great.
So he just said, I just did a search for this online. 2 dogs were executed during the Salem witch trials, one in Salem Village, one in Andover, Massachusetts. They were referred to as familiars. Was this discovered or proven any differently than that of humans as witches?
I did not want to talk about this because it's so disturbing. Oh, thanks for asking, but I hate that you asked that. Okay, yes. Oh, violence against animals is part of this, especially cats. I have a cat and a dog, and I honestly, my cat wouldn't come near me. He always hangs out on the desk when I'm working on things. And I jokingly asked him in my imagination, I said, Bendigo, what's up? You haven't visited me all day. And he said, yeah, I'm not so hot on that history with you humans. I mean, in my imagination. Okay, I'm not crazy. So, but yes, animals that were associated with the person who was accused would die with them. Yes, it's horrifying. So mostly cats, and cats retain the reputation of being slightly demonic or dangerous because they are not as loyal and domesticated as doggies, are doggies, but horses, like there's some very weird outlying cases, mostly cats. I didn't know about dogs in Salem. I'm not surprised, but yes, even a mouse. Yeah, they thought the spirit of whatever could be in these animals. So, sometimes people would sleep with dogs for warmth and protection, and those dogs could be at risk for accusation, or for accusation of sexual relations. I mean, some poor widow who's sleeping with her kitty cat, and they'd find the animals too. I know, like, yeah, so much to atone for. Samuel Paris was awful. He really was. So we should get together for coffee, Yeah. He was such a complaining, and the thing about Samuel Paris is he really wanted to save his own neck, and he wanted to get paid. He really wanted to get paid. He was like, you guys aren't paying me enough. And I get it. Like, he should have been paid, but like, he really, really failed as a leader. He failed so badly to address this crisis in a way that could have potentially brought the temperature down. And he absolutely did not. I judge him for that. Yes. Santeria is an indigenous religious practice that is all indigenous practices from non-white, non-European peoples have been subject to accusation of demonic practices. And so I don't touch that because it's not my business. Santeria is a religion of the Haitian people. And it has a diaspora as well. Am I right? Haitian. So Cuba, and yes, so it's not a European, Western Jewish and Christian. It's not a Protestant thing. It's an indigenous practice, and I don't know enough about it, but I would say that when we say witchcraft, we tend to mean it in a derogatory way. So I would say that it's a spiritual tradition, and there's a lot of information available about it. And maybe you could meet someone who is a practitioner of Santeria, and they can educate you if you'd be open to that. Correct. And I don't touch that again because those are completely different. They have different histories. There's different histories of indigenous religion and colonialism and religious violence all over the world. There's religious violence all over the world. Even the Buddhists kill each other. So if we have a sense that someone over there is less sophisticated, and we always just have to be careful to understand our own context as folks. Here we have to know what our history is, and I just try to not speak on things about which I am not an expert. Yeah, and so even the word witch and the term witchcraft has different meanings and different connotations in different cultural contexts.
So there was a gentleman from England, and I'm forgetting his name now, but he was known as the Witchfinder General.
Ah.
And he was responsible for more deaths than any other individual in that time frame. And I was a little surprised because, like you were saying, I know most of it happened in the Germanic lands, but I wish I could remember his name or the numbers, but I don't even have my phone to look it up right now. But there was someone, if you look up the Witchfinder General, you'll see he was responsible himself for thousands of burnings.
Yeah.
On the British Isles.
Yeah. Okay. I do not know a lot about the witch trials in England, and so it sounds like that's a big one. That sounds like he's a major player. Yes, the British Isles had some outbreaks, but even one person who's really zealous about bringing people in and doing them in can do so much harm. It's really terrifying. Hi.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation, but I was just thinking of two things. Once, long time ago, I read a book about the astronomer Copernicus's mother. She was declared a witch, and she was actually an herbalist. And something went wrong, and then she was declared a witch, and then she got into the big tower, locked up, and who knows what happened else. I've forgotten those details. But eventually, Copernicus, because he was a very smart man, and he connected with an earl or some other high figure in that village, managed to get her back out.
Wow, yeah.
That's one thing. And then I grew up, of course, in Germany, and we were always afraid of the witch in the woods. The Brother Grimm's, the stories, Hansel and Gretel, there was always a witch, or if you not behave, there is a black man, and they had a poster, and it had to do with some kind of a liquor, but it was called Sandman liquor, and that was a black figure, so we had an au pair, and it was interesting. She made us behave because of some of those little stories. Was interesting, but it has nothing to do with witchcraft as such, but the figures as symbols and causing fear.
That is so great that you mentioned that. The witch as the archetype is such a major part of folklore and fairy tales. And so you see her being used. She's a created figure, really, but she becomes really central to these, really, they're like morality tales, Hansel and Gretel, or they're tales that instruct us how we're going to survive, or how the wily wise child figures out a way out of her predicament. And there's often a witch figure, and sometimes she's a witch who turns into a good fairy. So there's this magical female archetype that takes different shapes, you know, in different cultures and different forms. But in the Western folkloric tradition, the woods, the forest is the place. It represents the unconscious. It represents danger. It represents the undomesticated aspect of the society. And again, when you think about so much of this happening in pre-industrial rural places, the woods really are dangerous. They're where bandits are hanging out, and they're also where people are meeting to do various things by moonlight, and they're sleeping in multiphasic sleep patterns and often in pre-industrial times. I don't know if you knew this, but like you have your first sleep and you go to bed till like 10 p.m. from like sunset to 10 or 11. You wake up, you have a few hours awake, and you could go out there in the moonlight and do some fun stuff, you know, have some meetings or dance or meet your lover or whatever. And then you go back to sleep, and then you wake up and have your day of labor. So the woods and the forest for the people of Salem is truly dangerous, because they are really under threat of starvation, always. They are living in this wild new terrain. They've come from England. A lot of them came from very comfortable lives in England. They were quite privileged. They had what they needed. They had food and nice clothes, and they come to this place which is like this totally terrifying wilderness, and they have to work the land and all this. So you can imagine just the terror of survival itself. And then I use the word Indian because the indigenous people I know use the word Indian, and they say, you know, we're Indians. So, but there was this obviously there were wars with the Indians and Europeans coming in, and all of this kind of conflict going on. Another thing that I think is represented well in the wilderness is at the time of the Salem witch trials, their charter from England, from the crown, was being changed. And I forget some of the details, but they were in precarious sort of settler circumstances, because the king had withdrawn the charter, and I forget who it was, but he had to go to England. So their charter was renewed. So they weren't even sure about their status there, and people are getting sick and dying, and it's just miserable and freezing cold. And then, you know, where are you going to get your food? So just the forest has always represented the untamed wild self and the repressed sort of shadow aspect of the self and the society. But then the actual physical forest is dangerous. There's wolves there, and there's, you know, stuff going on that children do disappear into the woods. And into the woods, maybe you should do Into the Woods next. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I just remember that the trauma. There's supposedly there was a lot of trauma from the French Indian Wars, and these girls, even if they hadn't themselves experienced, had heard stories, and there were, you know, a lot of kidnappings, killings, you know, massacres, all things, and so just hearing about this might have really affected them psychologically.
Very much so. Scalpings and violence done. I mean, the violence that they knew was being done also to those who were encroaching. I mean, the violence back and forth, settlers on Indians, Indians on settlers, kidnappings, abductions, people staggering back into the settlement, having experienced God knows what, and murder and fire, villages set on fire, and then, you know, all of this mutual violence and struggle, and they're just girls and they have no power. And so whatever was happening to motivate them, part imagination, part trauma, hormones. I don't know if they were subjected to sexual abuse. Certainly there's some evidence that George Burroughs was a no good guy and creepy. I don't know, but I haven't really looked into that. But there's some, you know, there's a lot going on. It's very, very difficult and frightening. And mass psychosis, right? I mean, exactly, like you can see how certain kinds of behavior really can be contagious. And especially if you're as helpless and frightened as all of them. Yeah. So a lot to think about. A lot to think about. Thank you so much. Thank you. See you at the theater.